Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the Missing Dots. In a world full of loud opinions and quiet confusions, there are questions most people avoid. But you didn't come here for silence. You came for truth. Today, we're diving into the kind of topic that makes scholars debate, critics uncomfortable, and listeners lean in a little closer. No filters, no fear, just clarity, evidence, and the courage to ask what others won't. Welcome to the conversation you were never supposed to hear, but absolutely need to.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to getting into this today.
Yeah, we are getting right into it because, honestly, the stack of sources sitting in front of me right now is staggering.
Oh, I'm sure. It's a lot of material.
It really is. I've been going through these classical treatises on usul al-fiqh,
Yes.
the foundations of Islamic jurisprudence and historical chronicles from those first few centuries, plus some modern academic papers on linguistic shifts.
Right, which is crucial for this topic.
Exactly. And of course, pages of my own notes analyzing the fiercest critiques leveled at this. Because our mission today for you, the listener, is to take all this dense material and extract the reality of a concept that is, well, it's highly weaponized by critics.
Highly weaponized, yes.
But at the same time, it's meticulously documented by traditional Islamic scholars. We are tackling the concept of naskh, abrogation in the Qur'an.
It is, it's definitely a heavy one.
It is. At its most basic level, it's this idea that certain verses in the Quran replaced, updated, or I guess suspended the legal rulings of earlier verses. And I'll be honest, when you first read about it in these sources without any historical grounding, it sounds like a massive theological vulnerability.
Right. It absolutely reads that way to the uninitiated eye. I mean, critics latch on to this concept of naskh because on the surface, it seems to suggest inconsistency.
Yeah, exactly. Like, did God change his mind?
Right, but the consensus across the classical sources we're looking at today, it establishes a very different intellectual baseline. We are not examining a static legal code that was just, dropped from the heavens as a fully bound index manual on a single afternoon.
Right.
The sources demand that we view this as a dynamic 23-year interaction, an interaction between a 7th century divine revelation and a living, breathing, and let's be honest, inherently flawed human society.
Right, 23 years of real-time sociological and political upheaval. I mean, you look at the community, they were transitioning from a deeply fragmented pagan tribal system in Mecca, where they were, a persecuted minority, to actually building a sovereign functioning state structure in Medina.
Exactly. The circumstances on the ground were shifting radically from year to year.
So looking at the historical timeline, the methodology of the revelation had to adapt. It had to meet those human beings exactly where they were, psychologically and socially.
Yeah, that historical context is really the only way to understand the mechanics of what is actually happening. When we look at the linguistic root of the word naskh in classical Arabic, it carries meanings like to copy, or to wipe out, or to replace.
Okay.
But when it solidified into a technical legal term, what the scholars of jurisprudence call a hukk, it came to mean the legal supersession of a prior ruling by a subsequent revelation.
So overriding an old law with a new one.
Essentially, yes. And if we break down the classical treatises, like those by al-Suyuti or al-Zarkashi, they categorize this phenomenon into 3 distinct operational types.
Let's map those 3 types out, actually, because the sources are very particular about the distinctions. From what I've read, the first type is by far the most common in the text, right?
Yes, absolutely the most common.
This is where the legal ruling is replaced, but the actual physical text of the verse remains in the Quran. Like, you can open a mushaf today, read the verse, recite it in your prayers for spiritual reward, but the legal injunction it contains is no longer active in Islamic law.
Right. That is the primary form of naskh you will encounter. The second type, it kind of flips that dynamic.
How so?
It's where the physical text itself was removed from the recitation of the Quran, but the legal ruling it established remains actively practiced in Islamic jurisprudence.
Oh, right.
Yeah, the classic example cited across the major schools of thought is the ruling on stoning for adultery. We'll get into that later. And then you have the third, much rarer category.
Or both are gone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Both the legal ruling and the physical text were completely decommissioned and removed from the Quran entirely.
The thing is, looking at this framework, it forces a very natural, modern assumption. My mind immediately goes to how we handle secular law today.
Sure.
It feels like a government passing a constitutional amendment. A legislature passes a law, they realize a few years later that it failed miserably or, had a massive loophole they didn't anticipate. So they have to issue an amendment to fix the mistake.
Right, that's the standard modern parallel people draw.
But if the Quran is considered the perfect, eternal word of God, framing naskh as an amendment or an error correction, it feels like a direct contradiction of divine perfection.
And that constitutional amendment analogy is exactly where most modern readers get tripped up. We really have to dismantle it.
Okay, let's dismantle it.
So, an amendment in secular law implies human fallibility. It implies the lawmakers lack the foresight to anticipate the socioeconomic fallout of their legislation.
Right, and that stuff.
Exactly. But naskh is rooted in an entirely different paradigm. The classical scholars use the term tadarruj, which translates to gradualism. It is not an error correction. It is a deliberate, pre-planned pedagogical strategy.
The sources actually refer to this as divine pedagogy. And there's this recurring analogy in the classical text that I think illustrates the mechanism perfectly. They compare the divine lawgiver to a master physician.
Yes, the doctor analogy is brilliant.
It really is. So if a patient comes into a hospital suffering from a severe acute fever, the doctor prescribes a highly aggressive medication designed specifically to break that fever.
Right.
But a week later, when the patient's temperature has stabilized and they enter the recovery phase, the doctor pulls that prescription and replaces it with a completely different regimen, maybe a mild restorative tonic or physical therapy.
And we have to look at the mechanism of that medical decision. If the doctor were to keep the patient on the aggressive fever medication during the recovery phase, that medication would become actively toxic.
It would literally harm the patient.
Exactly. The doctor didn't make a mistake with the first prescription. The first prescription was scientifically perfect for the exact biological state the patient was in on day 1.
Right.
When the prescription changes on day 7, it doesn't mean the doctor suddenly learned something new or realized an error. The doctor's medical knowledge was complete from the beginning. It was the biological condition of the patient that shifted.
So translating that back to the 7th century, the early Muslim community is the patient.
Precisely.
Their societal and spiritual health was constantly evolving over those 23 years. Applying a heavy, complex state law to a spiritually fragile community in Mecca would have been just as toxic as giving acute fever meds to a healthy person. They would have crushed them.
It would have resulted in mass apostasy or complete rejection of the message. The legislation evolved because the capacity of the community evolved.
That makes a lot of sense. But theories and analogies are helpful, but honestly, to really grasp the mechanics of this tadarruj, we need to look at the historical data.
Yes, let's look at the actual application.
The sources highlight several undisputed, universally accepted cases of this gradualism in action. And the most prominent one, the one that literally every scholar points to, is the prohibition of alcohol.
Cumber. Right, subhanAllah, this was not a swift overnight ban.
No, the sources track it across 4 very distinct methodical stages.
And the socioeconomic reality of the Hijaz region demanded that methodical approach. I mean, pre-Islamic Arabia was culturally saturated with wine.
It was everywhere.
It wasn't just a weekend indulgence. It was deeply embedded in their economy, their daily diet, their hospitality rituals, and their poetry. It was a true societal addiction.
Wow.
So if you look at the first stage of the revelation regarding this, found in Surah 16, verse 67, alcohol isn't banned at all.
Wait, really? It's not banned?
Not at all. It is merely mentioned factually as something people derive from dates and grapes, juxtaposed with good provision. It is a remarkably neutral acknowledgement of their reality.
Just laying the groundwork.
Exactly.
Then, as the community migrates to Medina and the social fabric starts to shift, we see the second stage. Surah 2, verse 219 is revealed. And this is where the cognitive dissonance is introduced.
Right.
The verse acknowledges that there is some benefit in wine and gambling, perhaps referring to the economic trade or the temporary social relief. But it explicitly states that the sin and the harm far outweigh the benefit.
It's planting a seed of moral doubt. It's forcing the community to start weighing their habits against their spiritual well-being.
And that seed requires time to germinate. You don't just uproot a generational addiction with a single philosophical point.
You really don't. But as their faith, their pawhead solidified, the legislation tightened. The third stage arrives with Surah 4, verse 43. This verse strictly prohibits Muslims from approaching their formal prayers while in a state of intoxication.
Okay, and if we look at the mechanics of this ruling, it is quietly revolutionary. Muslims are required to pray 5 times a day at relatively evenly spaced intervals.
Right, from dawn to the evening.
So if you can't be intoxicated during prayer, and the prayers are spaced throughout the day, you effectively don't have enough time to get drunk and sober up between the designated time.
Exactly. It was a functional behavioral weaning process that forced them into sobriety for the vast majority of their waking hours. It broke the physical habit loop before addressing the final legality.
That is so practical.
Alhamdulillah, it is. Finally, after years of this gradual conditioning, the fourth stage is implemented. Surah 5, verse 90 comes down, declaring alcohol an abomination and the handiwork of Satan, commanding a total and absolute avoidance.
And by this point, the historical chronicles tell us that the community was so spiritually prepared that they immediately poured their wine out into the streets of Medina.
They literally emptied the barrels.
There is a famous quote in the historical traditions from Aisha, the Prophet's wife, that summarizes this entire sociological strategy.
Yeah.
She pointed out that if the very first revelation in Mecca had been, do not drink alcohol and do not commit fornication, the people would have flatly responded, we will never stop drinking and we will never stop.
Right. They simply lacked the internal moral infrastructure to carry that weight at that time.
God prioritized building the foundation of their worldview first and only dropped the final legal hammer when the structure could actually support it.
It is a profound display of divine pragmatism. And another universally accepted example from the sources that highlights this psychological transition is the shift in the Qibla.
The direction of ritual prayer.
Yes. For over a decade during the intense persecution in Mecca, and for roughly 16 months after they migrated to Medina, the early Muslims prayed facing Jerusalem.
Which is fascinating when you think about the geopolitics of Medina at the time. I mean, Medina had a significant Jewish population. Praying toward Jerusalem established a massive, visible continuity with the previous Abrahamic prophets.
It did, but it also created complex social dynamics. Then, suddenly, Surah 2, verse 144 is revealed, fundamentally altering the physical orientation of the community. They are commanded to turn their faces away from Jerusalem and toward the sacred mosque in Mecca, the Kaaba.
We really have to appreciate the psychological whiplash at that moment. You have oriented your body, your profound moments of worship, toward one physical location for your entire life as a Muslim, and in a single day, the compass completely flips.
Yeah, it was huge. The Qur'an itself addresses the difficulty of this. It explicitly states that this shift was instituted as a deliberate test.
A test of loyalty.
Basically, yes. It was designed to distinguish those who followed the messenger purely out of submission to God from those who were attached to the message out of cultural convenience or habitual momentum.
It severed their dependency on the past and forged an entirely distinct, independent identity for the new community. It was a boundary-drawing exercise.
Exactly.
And then we have the third major example in the sources, which moves from social identity into the brutal reality of physical survival. The warfare ratios.
Ah, yes.
This is where the concept of taysir, the Islamic legal principle of facilitating ease, really comes into focus.
The historical context here is the aftermath of the early military encounters, specifically around the time of the Battle of Badr. In Surah 8, verse 65, the initial divine command sets a standard that is almost superhuman.
What was the standard?
It states that 20 patient, persevering believers will overcome 200 disbelievers. That is a legally mandated ratio of 1 to 10.
Wow.
If a Muslim military unit found themselves outnumbered 10 to 1, they were religiously obligated to hold their ground and fight. Fleeing was not an option.
Which is an unimaginably heavy psychological and physical burden. I mean, it represents the absolute zenith of bravery and reliance on God. But human biology is incredibly fragile. Soldiers bleed, they suffer from sleep deprivation, they experience profound trauma, fear, and battle fatigue.
Absolutely.
And the sources show that the very next verse, Surah 8, verse 66, acknowledges this physical reality. It says, now Allah has lightened your burden, for he knows that there is weakness in you, and it adjusts the mandatory standing ratio. Now 100 patient believers are required to stand against 200.
A 1 to 2 ratio.
Right. Notice the mechanism here. The divine lawgiver didn't miscalculate human endurance. The initial 1 to 10 ratio established the ultimate ideal, the gold standard of faith. But when the grueling, visceral reality of prolonged conflict began to wear down the human material of the community, the law was calibrated to protect them.
Yes, it is a transition from the ideal to the sustainable.
Okay, so I look at these three examples, the weaning off alcohol, the psychological test of the Qibla, the physical mercy of the warfare ratios, and the logic is incredibly tight. Makes total sense.
It's very cohesive.
But delving deeper into the sources reveals a massive, glaring historical contradiction.
Let's hear it.
If the mechanics of naskh are this clear and undisputed, why do the classical scholars fundamentally disagree on the mathematics of it? How many verses are we actually talking about here?
Ah, that discrepancy is perhaps the most heavily debated aspect of this entire field within classical academia.
Because when you track the historical timeline of scholarly consensus, the numbers are wildly erratic. You look at early, brilliant mind scholars like Ibn Hazm from Andalusia in the 11th century, and his treatises list over 200 abrogated verses in the Qur'an. 200.
That is a significant portion of the text.
It is. But then you fast forward a few centuries to al-Suyuti, the great Egyptian polymath of the 15th century, and he ruthlessly pares that list down to roughly 21 verses.
A massive drop.
And the progression doesn't stop there. By the time we get to the 18th century with Shah Waliullah in the Indian subcontinent, he conducts his own rigorous analysis and concludes there are only 5 clear, undeniable instances of naskh in the entire Qur'an.
The variance from over 200 to just 5 is staggering, and it demands an explanation.
Honestly, to a modern listener, world-class scholars being off by nearly 200 verses looks like a crisis of credibility. It makes the entire science look arbitrary, like they were just guessing.
I can see why it looks that way.
It's the equivalent of mistaking a routine clarification memo from human resources for a company-wide bankruptcy declaration. The scale of the error seems absurd.
It does seem absurd until you analyze the evolution of the Arabic language itself, specifically the technical terminology of the early Islamic period. Modern historians and linguists referred to this discrepancy as the linguistic trap.
The linguistic trap. Okay.
We have to remember that academic disciplines do not emerge fully formed. In the first 2 centuries of Islam, during the time of the companions and the generation immediately following them, the vocabulary of jurisprudence was incredibly fluid.
So they weren't using the word naskh with the strict microscopic precision of later centuries.
Not at all. The early Arabs used the word naskh in a broad conversational manner to denote absolutely any alteration, clarification, or nuance applied to a previous statement.
Really? Any alteration?
Any of it. If a verse laid down a broad, sweeping general rule and a subsequent verse introduced a highly specific exception to that rule, the early scholars casually referred to the second verse as having abrogated the first.
Which later scholars would categorize entirely differently. Let's look at a concrete example to make the mechanism of this linguistic trap clear. Let's talk about the concept of taxis, or specification.
Great example.
Suppose a verse is revealed that says, all birds are permissible for you to eat. That is a general ruling. A year later, another ruling comes down saying, you may not eat birds of prey, like falcons or eagles.
Under the fluid terminology of the first century, a scholar would say the rule allowing all birds has been abrogated, experienced naskh by the rule forbidding birds of prey.
But the general rule wasn't canceled. It hasn't been wiped out. You can still eat chickens, ducks, and pigeons. The original law is still 99% active. It just has an updated terms and conditions section.
Precisely the point. Or consider conditional clauses. If a verse said, fast for 3 days, and a later verse added, unless you are traveling, early scholars labeled that conditional clause as naskh. They were casting an incredibly wide linguistic net. So when Ibn Hazm compiled his massive list of 200 verses, he wasn't listing 200 laws that had been voided and deleted from practice. He was documenting every single instance where a general rule was specified, where a condition was attached, or where a linguistic ambiguity was clarified.
So it wasn't a failure of scholarship on Ibn Hazm's part. He was simply operating under an archaic, hyper-inclusive definition of the word.
Yes. And as the centuries pass, the science of usul al-fiqh, the intricate methodology of how laws are derived, became highly sophisticated. Scholars like al-Suyuti and Shah Waliullah realized they needed surgical precision.
They needed to tighten the definitions.
Exactly. They retroactively applied a much stricter, mature definition of naskh. To them, a ruling must be completely, 100% nullified and replaced by an entirely new ruling to qualify. No exceptions, no conditions. Total replacement.
And when you apply that rigorous, mature filter to the text, stripping away all the instances of mere specification or clarification, the list collapses from 200 down to a mere handful.
It shrinks drastically.
The product wasn't being recalled hundreds of times, it was just being deeply nuanced. Understanding this linguistic evolution completely shifts the landscape of the debate. It shows that the Qur'an is far more internally consistent and cohesive than early fluid terminology made it appear.
It completely neutralizes the statistical argument against the text.
But even with the numbers clarified, we can't avoid the philosophical elephant in the room.
Let's hear it.
The very concept that God would replace a law, even 5 times, triggers massive theological attacks. If you look at the debates between modern atheists, polemicists, and Islamic scholars, this is the battlefield. We are entering the theological minefield.
And historically, this isn't just a modern debate. The early theological schools, the Mutazilites, the Asharis, the Maturidists, they spent centuries dissecting the philosophical implications of this exact issue.
We have to ask the uncomfortable questions that arise in the sources. If God is fundamentally described as Al-Alim, the all-knowing, doesn't the act of abrogating a law imply that God changed his mind?
That's the core question critics ask.
To a layman, it looks like God enacted a law, watched how the humans reacted, realized it wasn't working, and had to pivot. Doesn't that negate the concept of divine omniscience? Furthermore, if Orthodox theology dictates that the Qur'an is the eternal, uncreated word of God, how can an eternal entity experience a before and after in its legislation?
The rigor with which classical theologians tackled these paradoxes is fascinating. The entire defense rests on untangling a crucial philosophical conflation. Critics invariably anthropomorphize the divine.
They treat God like a human.
Exactly, they project human cognitive limitations onto God. When a human legislature changes a law, it is almost always reactionary. We observe a failure, we learn new data we didn't possess previously, and we alter course. That implies a linear acquisition of knowledge.
Which cannot apply to an omniscient being.
Right. The classical theologians draw an impenetrable line between God's knowledge and God's command.
Okay, unpack that difference for me.
God's knowledge is pre-eternal and absolute. In the Islamic theological framework, God knew before the creation of time itself that the early Muslim community would require Law A in the year 615 CE, and that they would require Law B in the year 622 CE. The divine timeline was fixed and complete from the outset.
So the alteration doesn't occur within the mind or the knowledge of God. The alteration occurs strictly within the temporal reality of human history.
Yeah.
The applicability of the law is what changes.
Yes.
Going back to our physician analogy, the doctor doesn't undergo a crisis of medical knowledge when switching a patient from fever suppressants to vitamins. The entire trajectory of the treatment was charted out before the patient even entered the clinic.
The treatment plan was static. The patient's biology was dynamic. The change in the law is a reflection of human fluctuation, not divine indecision.
Okay, I understand the philosophical distinction between knowledge and command, but I want to push back on the actual text of the Quran itself because the phrasing provides ammunition for critics.
Sure, let's look at the text.
Let's examine Surah 2, verse 106. It is the foundational verse for this entire topic. It says, "We do not abrogate a verse or cause it to be forgotten, except that we bring forth one better than it or similar to it."
Yes, the famous verse.
The word used is better. Honestly, how can one word of the divine be intrinsically better than another word of the divine? If both emanate from absolute perfection, doesn't assigning a hierarchy of quality imply that the first law was somehow deficient?
That is a highly sophisticated linguistic critique, and scholars like Rashid Rida, operating in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, dedicated extensive commentary to it. The resolution lies in defining the metric of better.
How so?
The classical consensus is that better does not refer to the ontological quality of the divine speech. The speech of God cannot be graded on a curve of perfection.
So what is the metric?
The metric is maslahah, the core Islamic legal concept of human benefit and welfare. The term better refers entirely to the utility of the law for the human beings practicing it at that specific moment in time.
So it's about what works best for us.
Exactly. A law that is suddenly easier for a traumatized, exhausted community to follow is functionally better for them. Conversely, a law that requires more discipline but yields a higher spiritual reward because the community is now strong enough to bear it is also better for their spiritual growth.
So it's not that the author improved, it's that the tool was better calibrated for the material it was working on. I think framing it around maslahah, around human welfare, makes the philosophical premise of changing laws much easier to digest.
It grounds it in mercy.
But as we move deeper into the sources, we hit a layer of this topic that makes even the most well-read students of theology profoundly uncomfortable.
I know where you're going with this.
We aren't just talking about shifting legal codes anymore. We are talking about the physical integrity of the book itself. We're entering the highly controversial domain of naskh al-tilawa.
The abrogation of recitation. This is where the debate moves from philosophy to textual history.
We are talking about verses whose actual physical text was completely removed from the Qur'an. The sources point to several highly debated historical reports. The most infamous is the stoning verse, the Rajmum, which mandated the punishment of stoning for adultery.
Yes, that is the most frequently cited example.
There are also reports regarding a verse that detailed specific parameters for establishing foster kinship through breastfeeding 10 times. The reality is, you cannot find the text of these verses in any printed mushaf in the world today. Yet the legal precedents they established remain fully active and binding in the Sunnah and in classical Islamic law.
The retention of the law, coupled with the deletion of the text, is a profound historical anomaly, and it serves as a massive stumbling block for modern readers.
Critics utilize naskh al-tilawa to construct a narrative of textual corruption. They argue that the Qur'an we have today is incomplete, that it was mutilated by early political factions, or simply lost due to poor preservation.
They do make those claims, yes.
And they frequently weaponize a very specific, highly bizarre historical report found in some hadith collections. It's the story that a domestic animal, often described as a goat or a sheep, wandered into the home of Aisha after the Prophet had passed away and ate the manuscript page containing the verse of stoning from under her bed.
Right, the goat story.
The argument is, if God explicitly promised in Surah 15 to perfectly protect the text of the Quran, how can portions of it literally be consumed by livestock and vanish from history?
We have to surgically separate polemical internet noise from rigorous historical methodology here. Let's dismantle the goat narrative first, as it is a favorite talking point for Orientalist scholars and online critics.
Let's do it.
When you dive into the traditional sciences of hadith verification ilm al-rala, the vast majority of critical scholars point out severe structural weaknesses in the transmission chain of that specific report.
So it's a weak report to begin with.
Very much so. Many consider it anomalous or metaphorically representative of the verse's abrogation. But even if, for the sake of intellectual argument, we accept the event as entirely historical, the critics are relying on a massive logical fallacy regarding how the Qur'an was actually preserved.
What is the fallacy?
They are projecting a modern print culture mindset onto a 7th century oral society. The Qur'an was not a single fragile document resting on a piece of parchment under a mattress.
Right.
The primary vehicle for the preservation of the Qur'an was tawatur mass, concurrent oral transmission. The text was memorized perfectly, syllable by syllable, by hundreds, eventually thousands of hufaz. These were companions whose primary spiritual duty was internalizing the revelation.
And even physically, the sources note it was written down across a vast array of materials: shoulder bones of camels, palm fronds, white stones, pieces of leather, scattered across the homes of dozens of scribes in Medina.
Precisely. The idea that a single goat eating a single leaf of paper could permanently erase a verse from the collective consciousness of civilization that had mass memorized it is historically illiterate. If a piece of paper is destroyed, the revelation remains entirely intact within the unbreakable chain of mass transmission.
Okay, so a missing manuscript page doesn't equate to a missing scripture. But that still leaves the core issue unresolved. If it wasn't lost by accident, how does a verse legally and deliberately get removed from the text?
The Qur'an itself provides the operational mechanism for this in Surah 87, verses 6 and 7. It states, "We will make you recite, and you will not forget except what Allah wills."
Okay.
This establishes that forgetting, in the prophetic context, was not a biological failing of the human brain. It was a controlled, deliberate, divine decommissioning of a specific text. When God promised to protect the Qur'an, classical scholars unanimously agreed that this promise of preservation applied specifically to the authoritative canon.
The final version, essentially.
Yes. The finalized version of the text that God intended to remain binding for the global community until the end of time.
So if a verse was meant to be temporary, God actively removed it from the prophet's active recitation and subsequently the memories of the companions.
Correct.
And the historical record of the Quran's physical compilation supports this.
When Caliph Uthman standardized the written mushaf a few decades later, it wasn't a closed-door editorial process. It was a massive, public, heavily scrutinized event.
The compilation required ijma, absolute consensus. The companions involved were individuals who had fought wars and sacrificed their families for this religion. They were willing to die for a single vowel of this book.
Right.
If a verse like the stoning verse was deliberately left out of the Uthmanic compilation, it was because there was unanimous, undeniable consensus among the thousands of living witnesses that the prophet himself had indicated its recitation was formally abrogated by divine decree before his death.
So it wasn't a scribal error or political censorship. It was final editing by the original author.
Beautifully put. But that brings up a fascinating legal question regarding the stoning verse specifically. If the author decided to remove the text, why did the community maintain the brutal legal ruling in the Sunnah?
The scholars suggest it served a profound legal and psychological purpose. By keeping the severe penalty of stoning active in the prophetic practice, the Sunnah, but removing it from the daily, ubiquitous recitation of the Qur'an, it created a strict legal barrier.
A legal barrier. How so?
It ensured that such a definitive, ultimate punishment was heavily insulated by the stringent evidentiary requirements and contextual nuances of prophetic law. It prevented laypeople from simply reading the verse in isolation and applying an extreme penalty without the massive judicial hurdles required by the Sunnah.
Like the nearly impossible requirement of 4 credible eyewitnesses to the actual physical act.
Exactly. The removal of the text acted as a buffer against zealous misapplication.
The layers of legal protection there are incredibly intricate. Okay, having navigated the physical integrity of the text and the mechanics of removal, we have to steer this conversation into the most turbulent, heavily criticized waters of the entire subject.
I'm ready.
We have to address the specific textual content that triggers the most intense, visceral debate globally, both inside and outside the Islamic tradition. We are talking about the verses regulating warfare.
Specifically, we are looking at the ramifications of the sword verse.
Surah 9, verse 5. This verse commands the believers to kill the polytheists wherever you find them, capture them, and besiege them. Critics point to this single verse and claim it acts like a theological black hole.
A black hole. That's an interesting way to put it.
While the argument is that this one Medinan verse forcefully abrogates and cancels out over 120 earlier Meccan verses that preach peace, patience, tolerance, and coexistence. The most famous casualty of this alleged bulldozer effect is Surah 2, verse 2050. There is no compulsion in religion.
It is the ultimate flashpoint in modern discourse.
I'm going to push back aggressively here on behalf of the critics, because this is the narrative that dominates the internet, political debates, and media analysis. If verse 9.5 cancels all previous peaceful injunctions, doesn't that confirm the worst fears of the critics?
Let's address those fears.
Does it mean that the peaceful, tolerant Islam of the early Meccan period was nothing more than a strategic facade? Was it just a pragmatic holding pattern because the Muslims were politically weak and numerically inferior? Does the existence of the sword verse prove that Islam is inherently, foundationally violent the moment it achieves political and military sovereignty?
That is the defining question. And to answer it accurately based on the sources, we have to completely dismantle what the academic tradition calls the maximalist view of abrogation.
Okay, the maximalist view.
We must be very clear here. The extremist maximalist position, the idea that 9.5 acts as a blanket cancellation of all peaceful relations with non-believers, is thoroughly rejected by the most rigorous classical scholars, as well as brilliant modernists like Muhammad Abduh in Egypt and Muhammad Assad.
So the bulldozer theory is structurally flawed. Where does their argument break down?
The fatal flaw in the critics' argument, and frankly in the argument of some modern extremist groups who misuse the text, is that they fundamentally confuse values with rulings.
Values with rulings.
Based on the strict rules of usul al-fiqh we established earlier, naskh can only apply to contingent legal rulings. It does not, and functionally cannot, apply to fundamental moral values or ontological truths.
Because values don't have an expiration date.
Precisely. The principles of divine mercy, fundamental justice, the sanctity of treaties, and the ontological reality that true faith cannot be coerced into a human heart, these are absolute. You cannot abrogate a moral virtue.
Oh, it's fixed.
Yes. Therefore, the sweeping declaration that there is no compulsion in religion remains a permanent, unalterable reality of the faith.
So if the overarching values of peace and tolerance remain intact, what exactly is happening mechanically in verse 9.5? Why the sudden violent directive?
This requires a highly localized geopolitical look into the 9th year of the Hijra. Surah 9 was one of the very last chapters revealed. The Muslims in Medina had established a complex network of peace treaties with surrounding pagan tribes, most notably the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which was designed to guarantee a decade of non-aggression.
Right.
However, historical records confirm that specific allied pagan tribes, particularly the Banu Bakr, flagrantly violated these treaties. They committed high treason, actively supplying weapons and allying with enemies to literally wipe the Muslim community off the map.
So it wasn't a philosophical disagreement. It was an active, kinetic, existential military threat against the state.
Exactly. When you analyze the Arabic phrasing and the historical context of verse 9.5, it is not a blank check for global conquest. It was a highly specific, localized military directive targeting those exact treaty-breaking tribes who had initiated lethal hostilities.
I see.
What was abrogated by 9.5 was not the core value of peace. What was abrogated was the Meccan prohibition on fighting back.
Ah, that is a massive distinction. In Mecca, for 13 years, the Muslims were legally prohibited from lifting a weapon, even in basic self-defense against torture. They were commanded to turn away and endure. 9.5 lifted that prohibition of pure pacifism.
It lifted the prohibition because the geopolitical reality had changed. But it did not cancel the general universal mandate to maintain peace with non-combatants, neutral tribes, or those who honor their diplomatic agreements.
Which makes sense logically.
And the proof of this is literally in the very next breath of the text. Right after the intense military command of 9.5, verse 9.6 states that if any of the polytheists seek asylum from you, grant it to them, let them hear the word of God, and then physically escort them to a place of safety.
You don't provide armed escorts to safety for a demographic if your universal, unabrogated mandate is to exterminate them. The logic doesn't hold.
It shatters the maximalist argument entirely. What we are witnessing in Surah 9 is not violent opportunism. It is the complex evolution of statecraft.
It's the transition from being a stateless, persecuted, religious minority relying on pacifism to functioning as a sovereign political entity with a moral and legal duty to defend its citizens from slaughter.
Absolutely.
The ethics of power dictate that a state cannot remain purely pacifist when its people are facing a war of annihilation. The laws of engagement and warfare were revealed strictly as the necessity for national defense emerged.
And that nuance, the balance between peaceful coexistence and the right to sovereign defense, is essential for understanding how the text operates.
Which brings us to the ultimate challenge of this entire subject. Understanding the 7th century geopolitical context is fascinating history. But how does this framework survive contact with the 21st century?
That is the million-dollar question.
How do modern Muslims, who live in complex nation-states governed by UN charters, international law, and globalized economies, apply these historic texts? How do they navigate these apparent shifts in rulings without feeling like they have to discard the classical tradition to survive the modern world?
This question brings us to the absolute frontier of modern Islamic jurisprudence, and the mechanism scholars are using to bridge this gap centers around a profoundly elegant legal concept known as maqasid al-sharia.
The objectives of Islamic law. I've seen this term dominating the works of contemporary scholars.
It is the paradigm shift of modern fiqh. While the roots of maqasid trace back to classical giants like al-Shatibi in the 14th century, it has been heavily championed and refined by modern thinkers, historic reformists like Fazlur Rahman, and contemporary legal theorists like Jasser Atta.
Okay, so what does this approach actually do?
The maqasid approach fundamentally changes how we view naskh. Instead of looking at the verses of the Qur'an as a rigid mathematical ledger where a later verse simply cancels and deletes an earlier verse, the maqasid approach zooms out.
Zooms out to what?
It forces us to look at the shared, overarching divine purpose that unites all the verses across the timeline.
So we are looking for the why behind the what. What kind of overarching purposes did the classical scholars identify?
They identified 5 foundational objectives that every single ruling in Islamic law seeks to protect and preserve. The preservation of faith, which is din. The preservation of life, nafs. The preservation of intellect, aql. The preservation of lineage or family structure, nays. And the preservation of property or wealth, mal.
I want to offer an analogy to make this abstract legal theory relatable because it really crystallizes the concept for me.
Go for it.
Instead of viewing the Quran as a static literalist rulebook where old pages are literally ripped out and thrown away when a new ruling arrives, the Maqasid approach treats the Quran more like a highly advanced compass.
I like that, a compass.
Right. The compass always points toward true north. Those 5 objectives, life, intellect, faith, that is true north. But the actual physical path you have to take around the mountain to reach the north changes dramatically depending on the weather, the terrain, the altitude, and the tools you have in your backpack.
That is a brilliant visualization. And if we apply that compass analogy back to our most famous example, the gradual prohibition of alcohol, you see the Maqasid framework in perfect operation. What is the true north regarding alcohol? It is the preservation of the intellect, the aql.
Right, keeping the human mind clear, rational, and capable of moral judgment.
every single historical stage of those verses, from the initial verse pointing out the societal harms to the behavioral conditioning of banning it during the 5 daily prayers, all the way to the final absolute prohibition. Every stage was pointing toward that exact same objective.
The true north.
Yes, the earlier verses aren't dead or useless just because their specific legal ruling was superseded. They are vital data points. They teach modern scholars the divine methodology of how to guide a deeply flawed society toward a moral objective through patience and psychological insight.
So how does a modern scholar actually apply this compass today? Give me an example of how this methodology solves the 21st century problem.
We see it utilized brilliantly in the emerging field of fiqh al-aqliyat minority jurisprudence. When Muslims migrate and live as demographic minorities in non-Muslim countries, whether in Europe, North America, or elsewhere, the geopolitical reality of Medina in the 9th year of the Hijra is no longer their reality. They are not a sovereign state facing down an allied tribal army.
Where terrain has changed.
Exactly. So modern scholars, using the Maqasid framework, can look back at the Meccan verses. The verses emphasizing diplomatic patience, passive resistance, deep intercommunity dialogue, and peaceful coexistence.
The ones the critics say are canceled.
Exactly. Under the old, rigid maximalist view, those verses were deemed canceled by the Medinin sword verses. But through the lens of Maqasid, scholars recognize that those Meccan verses were simply calibrated for a minority community lacking state power. Therefore, those verses are fully reactivated and perfectly applicable to the context of Muslims living in the West today.
Because the objective, the preservation of faith and life, requires the Meccan methodology in a modern Western democracy, not the military methodology. It proves the text isn't functionally trapped in the 7th century. We also see this in modern bioethics, right? Issues the early community couldn't even fathom.
Absolutely. Think about complex issues like organ donation or in vitro fertilization. You won't find a direct verse about IVF. But by looking at how naskh prioritized the preservation of lineage and the preservation of life over time, modern jurists can extrapolate the underlying divine intent and issue highly sophisticated rulings on modern medical technology.
That is incredible.
The framework of naskh, when understood through these higher objectives, actually provides the exact mechanism the tradition needs to adapt dynamically to the 21st century without ever breaking the chain of theological authenticity.
The flexibility is built into the architecture from day one. Looking back at this massive stack of sources, I realized that if the Qur'an had simply been dropped from the sky as a complete, static, uncompromising book on the very first day in Mecca, this entire complex science of abrogation wouldn't exist.
You wouldn't need to.
There would have been no psychological test of changing the Qibla, no merciful adjustments to the warfare ratios, no brilliant gradual weaning off of cultural addictions. But history shows it didn't happen that way. And digging into the linguistics, the theology, and the profound legal objectives paints a picture completely opposite to what the critics present.
It reveals a profound divine empathy. Abrogation, properly understood, is not a flaw in the transmission of the text. It is the ultimate historical proof that God values the reality of human growth.
It's beautiful, really.
It serves as the living documented record of a 23-year conversation between the divine and a struggling, bleeding, real-world community. It is the historical guarantee that God does not demand the impossible from us before meticulously preparing the human heart to carry the weight of it.
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.